So we're getting, I like this. I like the physiology of the cardiovascular system. And before we even start talking about the cardiac cycle and blood flow through the heart, think about this. Look, your whole cardiovascular system is plumbing. You have a pump, and you have a bunch of pipes. Pipes carry the liquid through the house and bring it back to pump. Does that make sense? If you need more fluid coming to the area, what can you do with plumbing? You open the shower. The pressure is low. How can you increase the pressure? Can you turn up the pump? Seriously? Well, maybe no, but you can go to the Home Depot and get better pump. Can you? Probably, I suppose. Not a plumber, but I suppose you can do it. Like if you install really lousy pump, the pressure in your shower is not going to be good. So you need better pump, right? So you can kick up the pump. You can pump harder. Or if you open, how can you increase the amount of, what is easier to use for extinguishing fire? This or the fire hose? The fire hose. So you can make the pipe bigger. That's basically the main difference between the cardiovascular system and the regular plumbing. Pipes can get bigger and smaller. That's it. Other than that, the whole concept is the same. Okay? So first we're going to learn, and it's very straightforward, how the blood flows through the heart. Okay? The order of events. So we have two circuits. We have the pulmonary and the systemic. Okay? A bit of comparative physiology and evolutionary biology. Cold-blooded animals, like amphibia, frogs basically. How many chambers in the heart do they have? 3. Yeah. They have 1 ventricle. They have 2 atria, but 1 ventricle. And this doesn't allow them to separate the circuits. Does that make sense? Because they have, so how do they breathe, frogs? You never asked that question. How do they breathe? Did you see frogs doing this? Swallowing all the time. They swallow air. Because that's the only way they can put air in the lungs. They don't have diaphragm. They don't have diaphragm and they don't have rib cage. So they can't expand the chest to bring air in. So they have to swallow. Do you think it's efficient? It's not efficient. So they have to get oxygen through the skin. And since the skin is the part of systemic circuit, they cannot separate systemic circuit from the pulmonary circuit, since they bring oxygen from both circuits. Does that make sense? And therefore, they mix oxygenated and non-oxygenated blood. Therefore, they cannot have the same level of metabolism as warm-blooded animals. In case of reptiles, so reptiles are slightly different. Reptiles have 4 chambers, like true reptiles, crocodiles, and essentially birds. You ask, dude, birds are not reptiles. Well, birds are actually feathered reptiles if you look at them. The product of evolution of reptiles. They have 4 chambers. So there are certain restrictions that reptiles put on themselves. Basically the fact that they have scaly skin, they have dry skin. That was the main restriction. They had to change the excretion system because we excrete urea Reptiles excrete uric acid, and that was followed by the whole chain of changes in organ systems, which pretty much made them cold-blooded, because energetically they couldn't be warm-blooded and produce uric acid. It's too energetically demanding. Okay. And then you have mammals, which have 4 chambers as well, and we have separation of pulmonary and systemic circuit, which allows us to maintain extremely high level of energy metabolism. Okay. So systemic circuit is the part that runs through the tissues. You see the red part here? It's the atrial part. Sorry, not atrial, arterial part. And that's the part where blood is delivered to tissues. Then what happens in tissues with oxygen? Oxygen goes from blood to tissues, good. And CO2 goes from tissues to blood, which is reflected here as the blue. So veins collect that blood and bring it back to the heart. Now, from the heart, where would you send deoxygenated blood? To the lungs. So deoxygenated heart enters pulmonary circuit, okay, via pulmonary arteries, gets oxygenated, and returns via pulmonary veins to the heart. Goes back out and runs like this. Does that make sense? Good? You can have it, but we're going to talk about it in much simpler terms. I will show you a very nice picture how to make sense out of blood flow through the heart. First of all, which circuit is smaller, pulmonary or systemic? Pulmonary. Which circuit pumps smaller amount of blood in 1 minute? No. Same. Both circuits run the same amount of blood in 1 minute. They have same cardiac output. But now think about this. You have small circuit which accepts 5 liters of blood in a minute. You have really large, and you have to run the same amount of blood in the same amount of time, but through much more vessels. So which circuit will have faster flow? Systemic. Because you need to run the same volume of blood, but through much more pipes. So faster, meaning in terms of blood pressure. What does that mean? Higher blood pressure. So systemic circuit is faster, blood pressure is higher, and partially it is higher due to the resistance. If you have more pipes, you work against higher resistance. Does that make sense? Pulmonary circuit is slow, blood pressure in the pulmonary circuit is lower, and because resistance is not that huge. But the amount of blood that goes through each circuit is the same. What if they are imbalanced? If you have more blood in the pulmonary circuit than in systemic, it's called congestive heart failure. You have congestion in the pulmonary circuit. If you have pulmonary circuit congested, what's going to happen to the blood pressure in the pulmonary circuit? If it has more blood than it should, it's going to go up. Those blood vessels, those veins and arteries, pulmonary veins and arteries, they're fairly thin, fragile. When you elevate blood pressure there, the patient is going to be present with pulmonary edema. Because that elevated blood pressure would push the fluid outside of the blood vessels into the lungs. Does that make sense? Now, how can it happen that you have more blood in the pulmonary circuit, or should I say, not enough blood in the systemic. Left side fails. The left side of the heart pushes the blood into the systemic circuit. If the pump is bad, it's not going to push enough blood in the systemic circuit. Blood that it doesn't push in the systemic will remain in pulmonary. And vice versa, if right side fails, then you have systemic congestion that mainly leads to the edematous tissues. Does that make sense? We'll come back to congestive heart failure later. Now, let's talk about blood flow through the heart. What I find, and previously, I was told that it actually works. You draw the heart, the square. Okay? I mean, you can draw it like this, in the form of an ass, but that's actually what this symbol means. This is actually a butt, originally. That symbol meant the rear end of a female. In the medieval times, that was it. And then don't ask me how it acquired the meaning of heart. So this is your heart, okay? And we're going to do the proper siding. So that's going to be right side and that's going to be left. Does that make sense? That's going to be atrium, that's going to be ventricles. Okay? So let's say blood returns to the heart from the systemic circuit. Which chamber does it go to? Right atrium. Through which great vessel? Through which? Vena cava. Okay, so we can put VC here. That make sense? From right atrium, where does it go next? Right ventricle. Is there a valve involved? Tricuspid. From right ventricle, where does it go? Into the pulmonary arteries. Well, pulmonary trunk / pulmonary arteries. Let's say pulmonary, and I don't know why it's R. Pulmonary arteries. Is there a valve involved? Pulmonary. I prefer using pulmonary valves. Some people prefer to use pulmonary semilunar. We know it's semilunar. So pulmonary valve. So from the pulmonary arteries, it enters which circuit? Where does it go? Which organ? Lungs. And from lungs, it goes back into left atrium. Through the first pulmonary veins. From left atrium, blood enters. Left ventricle, very good. Valve involved? Mitral valve. And from left ventricle, blood is released into aorta through aortic valve. And from aorta, it enters and from tissues, it returns into vena cava. Does that make sense? You just learned blood flow through the heart. Basically, sort of first step of getting through cardiovascular, this should be like multiplication table for you. Does that make sense? So and what I like, all the same stuff, everything is written on this scheme, okay, with all the proper anatomical picture. Valves, chambers, vessels, that's great. I'm not arguing that I'm not saying that it's bad. But this schematic outline, you just have to do it. Do it several times. And you have to remember each step, because I'm going to ask you about these steps. You're going to get questions, what type of, where and what type of blood does right atrium receive? Deoxygenated from tissues. What is the function of left ventricle? When blood gets from left atrium to right atrium, well, it doesn't, right? But if left atrium to left ventricle, what is the valve that's found there? Does that make sense? So just having this in mind and being able to draw it will give you like 5 answers on the exam right away. Does that make sense? So I have nothing to say. That's it. That's blood flow through the heart. We can move on now. Seriously. It's just. There is another circuit called coronary circuit. Technically, it's a part of systemic, right? Because blood, cardiac tissue is a tissue. Heart is an organ. Okay? But we kind of separate coronary circuit because it's a little bit functionally peculiar, should I say. Okay? So those are here coronary arteries, right and left. And as far as I remember, on the study guide, I want you to know right coronary artery, left, okay, right coronary, left coronary, and interventricular. Anterior interventricular, that's it. Know these 3. They biggest. Okay? In terms of the coronary veins, you have a pretty large, now this on the bottom here, it's the anterior view. So this large vessel in the back is called coronary sinus. Coronary sinus essentially collects the blood from all cardiac muscle eventually. All other coronary veins, they drain blood into the coronary sinus. Does that make sense? So coronary sinus, what does it empty? Huh? Right atrium, yeah. So if you look at the right atrium here, you have vena cava inferior, you have vena cava superior, and on this image, you just, trust me, that's the coronary sinus. It empties into the right ventricle as well, through the separate hole. Right atrium as well, through the separate hole. Does that make sense? So you have 3 vessels that empty into the right atrium. 2 vena cava and coronary sinus. Does that make sense? Where do coronary arteries originate from? It's kind of written there. Aorta. Not just aorta, base of aorta. It makes perfect sense. Think about this. If you will look at this heart. So this is aorta. So blood is being pumped this way. It enters the descending aorta and almost immediately goes into the coronary arteries. Because it's just next to it, right? Perfect sense. Left coronary artery and atrioventricular, anterior interventricular artery, they supply carry the most blood. They're most important, let's put it this way. Because they supply left ventricle. Why left ventricle is so important and takes so much blood? Pumps systemic, so the walls are much thicker. I'm not going to say when, I'm still holding my fingers crossed. If we get the hearts, okay, when you dissect them and you look at the walls of the left ventricle, they are enormous. They're really, really thick. Right ventricular walls are much smaller. Does that make sense? a lot of anastomosis there, people, which means smaller blood vessels are connected to each other. Now, is it going to prevent the heart attack? No. Is it going to help with the circulation, so-called collateral circulation? Yes. So it means that if some small tiny vessel gets obstructed, it's not going to kill the huge portion of the cardiac muscle. Do I make sense? Now, heart attack. Two types, type 1, type 2. Type 1 is like true heart attack. Blood clot ends up in one of the coronary arteries, blocks the blood flow to the huge portion of the heart. And what happens to the cardiac muscle? Dies eventually. Now, this is an important thing. So, first of all, disclaimer, I'm not a medical care professional by any means. But from the standpoint of physiology, when there is no oxygen getting to the tissues, can tissues still metabolize? Well, they can. They switch to fermentation. Your muscles, when you exercise hard, they primarily switch to fermentation. The deal is, say you're doing a lift, like really heavy lift. You lifted and you're tired. What did you do? What would you do? You just probably walk around, right? Just take a break. Your heart can't breathe. I mean, it has to pump. So if it switches to fermentation, it keeps pumping. The problem is that pH in the cardiac cells, it drops. Acidity stimulates mitochondria, which start to direct the cells to the apoptosis. The calcium is all messed up. I don't remember if it's pumped in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I think it cannot be pumped in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's all kind of problems immediately. So it's going to go for some time, and that's important. Why? When the person experiences the heart attack, doesn't mean that the heart is dead. Like, oh God, I have myocardial infarction, half of my heart is gone. No. The sooner you will deliver that person to the ER, the better chances for survival. We have one faculty member that experienced a heart attack in the class. And we're lucky that we had another faculty member who's a medical professional who quickly diagnosed it, loaded the guy in the car, and brought him, you know what I'm talking about. And brought the guy to the ER, and he's fine. Okay. He got a stent. Okay. So that's one. Occlusion. Complete occlusion due to the clot. We'll get to the main sources of clot. Vasospasm, or endothelial dysfunction. That's my realm. I was studying endothelial dysfunction for 5 years on mice. Basically, what happens is your blood vessels are in the precise balance between dilation and constriction. Endothelial dysfunction, by definition, is when your blood vessels tend to constrict. Does that make sense? They just tend to constrict. So, when they respond to something with the abnormal constriction, the blood flow is cessated, and it may cause even transient, but still myocardial infarction. Does that make sense? You can have atherosclerosis. The main treatment for coronary artery atherosclerosis is stent. Do you know what the stent is? Those of you who don't, what happens? So you have blood vessel. Surgeon inserts basically an elastic tube inside of the vessel, and this tube widens the vessel, restoring the blood flow. The main problem is that when you stick something like that in the vessel, the response from the blood vessel walls is inflammation. They don't like it. And inflammation always leads to repair. And in this case, repair will include growth of smooth muscle cells. So eventually, blood vessel will narrow down itself around the stent, and you need another stent. A buddy of mine in Louisiana, he was doing a very elegant work. They were making stents out of polymer, not metal, and they were covering them with resveratrol. Ever heard the name resveratrol? You may have heard about it. It's like a magic pill. It's a chemical that is isolated from red wine. So they covered it. It's anti-inflammatory, and basically what they showed it in rats, that compared to regular stents, those polymer stents with resveratrol coating had about 3 times longer time before they collapsed. It's a big deal. He's got like interview on one of the major channels. He was on American Heart Association website and whatnot. Now, word of warning. If you think that I just justified red wine consumption, well, you can, but in order to get physiologically active dose of resveratrol, you need to drink 4 bottles of wine a day. So if you prefer cirrhosis to a heart attack, it's your choice. And supply-demand imbalance. Basically, now if you think about it, supply-demand imbalance is at the nature of the heart attack. When your heart pumps, it requires a certain amount of blood coming in. If coronary vessels cannot deliver that amount of blood due to the clot, atherosclerosis, or constriction, that's imbalance. A little factoid, I mentioned Dr. Nussbaum here. He's a weightlifter. He's an athlete. I mostly run. So we have a long-standing feud, what's better or worse for your health. And he once gave me the actual clinical study that demonstrated regular marathon runners have higher frequency of coronary atherosclerosis than general population. It's puzzling. I have no idea why. Well, look, I'm Russian. So like in a week after that, he had a paper on his door stating that people who do the weightlifting, they experience stroke much more frequently than the regular population. So we're still figuring out what's worse. Anyway, the main problem with myocardial infarction is that when muscle cell dies, cardiomyocytes, cardiac muscle cells, they cannot be replaced. Well, they will be replaced, not by the muscle. When they die, it's going to happen, the I word, inflammation. Inflammation results in repair, and in this case, scar tissue will be connective. It can't contract. So, contractile ability of the heart goes down. One good reason to do any type of physical activity is that your heart, when you do regular physical activity, gets bigger. So even if you experience the heart attack, the effect of it on the bigger heart will be much less. Do I make sense? Percentage-wise, less heart dies. Now, I don't know about like how many heart attacks one can experience, but yeah, people who have multiple heart attacks, one after another, basically they may approach the point when their heart just not compliant with the demands. That is totally possible. Now, I kind of scared you with myocardial infarction. The precursor of it is so-called angina pectoris, which is basically a chest pain. Angina pectoris is usually a sign of a partial occlusion of a coronary artery. It's not complete, just a little bit less blood than it should be. Does that make sense? Now, with that said, we going into the physiology of the cardiac muscle. This is the part that is hated by students the most, because that's basically ion transport, action potentials, and all that kind of crap. First, good news is cardiac muscle contraction is very similar, practically identical to skeletal muscle contraction. Well, whether it's a good news or not, it's up to you. Yeah, if you still remember skeletal muscle contraction, good for you. If you don't remember it, well, I will remind you. So no worries about it. Anatomically, first, they have usually one nucleus, and they branched. Now that branching is really important, because if you think about it, when we talk about skeletal muscle, when skeletal muscle contracts, it has to shorten along one axis, right? Like this. Okay? When cardiac muscle contracts, what essentially it has to do is it has to make big chamber a small chamber. So it's not one axis of contraction. And that branching allows that chamber to get smaller. Does that make sense? Muscle cells are connected by so-called intercalated discs. So these discs contain two key structures, two types of cell-to-cell junctions. Desmosomes, which are strong junctions that hold cells together, but they're also somewhat elastic. Somewhat. We good? So desmosomes hold cells together. And gap junctions. Does anyone remember what the gap junction is? Basically. Like a window. Yep, it's an ion channel. It allows cells to exchange ions. Which means you depolarize, that's a horrible word, I know, but you depolarize one cell, and that depolarization can cause depolarization in adjacent cells, and that's the wave of depolarization. That makes sense? Okay, so that's intercalated discs. Muscles are striated. What makes a muscle cell striated? Presence of which internal structures? S word. Sarcomeres. Awesome. Sarcomeres. They also have sarcomeres. And the fact that they have sarcomeres means that they contract like skeletal. So it's same sliding filament contraction. Does that make sense? You have those Z discs between sarcomeres that get closer. All the same gig. Does that make sense? They have sarcoplasmic reticulum, they have T-tubules. So basically the entire idea of depolarizing the muscle is all the same. Okay? Mechanism of contraction. So yeah, we used to have to do a little reenactment. I'm not sure if we're going to do it this semester with my AP1 group, about the father and the mother and the daughter and the son at the prom. Not the son, the boyfriend at the prom, no? Never heard about it? Well, if you're too embarrassed to do it, we don't have to. But it's pretty fun, to explain. So basically what you have is you have thick filaments, right, the myosin, and you have the thin filaments, the actin. Everybody follows me? And they slide against each other. That's it. Well, it's not it. There's some other important details. So when muscle is relaxed, actin and myosin do not interact. Does that make sense? So in our rendition of that play was that myosin is the boyfriend and the actin is the girlfriend. And they at the dance. Okay, but they can't dance yet. The reason for it is because there's tropomyosin that's dead. It doesn't let the girl to dance with the boyfriend. Okay, tropomyosin essentially blocks the interaction between actin and myosin. But of course, you know, we want full family, so there's mom involved. It's troponin. So troponin interacts with tropomyosin. It sits at the tropomyosin. So mom kind of holds father, you know, the hand. But still no dance. Until calcium comes in. And calcium is a friend of a family. So calcium binds to troponin, so it starts to talk to a mother. Well, mom pulls father into the conversation. So troponin, after interaction with calcium, pulls tropomyosin away from binding sites on the actin. And now, the girl and the boy can dance. Actin and myosin can form a cross bridge. And that cross bridge is what initiates the contraction. Does that make sense? So basically, if you have calcium in the cell, there's going to be a contraction. You pump calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, there's no contraction. One of the big differences between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle is this. Sarcoplasmic reticulum that stores calcium is not only simpler, its role in the calcium supplement is a little smaller, which means cardiomyocytes can get calcium from extracellular fluid. Does that make sense? So basically, if you simply inject calcium into a patient, the force of contraction will go up. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what cross-bridge, this contraction, cross-bridge, what does it require for the contraction? Which molecule? ATP. This is ATP. And this is one of the phosphates. Okay? Does that make sense? This is actin, and my hand, well, my forearm is the myosin head. My forearm is this. So myosin head binds ATP. What does it do with ATP molecule? To release energy, huh? Well, second, it breaks it first. When it breaks it, what is released? Energy. And that energy is used to charge the myosin head. Cook it back. No release yet. In that cooked position, head can bind the actin, presuming calcium is like here. Does that make sense? Then, you're absolutely right, it releases phosphate, and actually ATP as well, and discharges, pulls it, propels it. So that's your sliding filament thing. And it stays stuck. What does it need to be unstuck? What does it need to bind to get unstuck? ATP. It binds ATP. Binding of ATP breaks down that bridge, right? ATP is broken. Charge. Release. Pull. Another ATP. And it just goes on and on. It's cross-bridge cycle. So, what can stop cross-bridge cycle? you can run out of calcium or ATP. Does that make sense? That's it. Calcium or ATP. We clear? Any questions? That was a quick review. I don't think I'm going to be asking you about specifically cross-bridge cycle. I'm going to ask you about role of troponin, tropomyosin, actin myosin. Know that. Not the cross-bridge. So the moment, depolarization, and all that kind of stuff. So what should we start with? Okay, let's, you know what? First of all, does heart have nervous input? Is it stimulated by nerves? Direct. Yeah. Which nerve? Directly. Which nerve is the main vagus, main regulator of the heart rate? Does that make sense? Vagus nerve, well, branch of vagus nerve, yes. Good. So we figured. Can it beat without any innervation? Again, I'm Russian, and even I know American pop culture better, it seems. Did anyone see Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? When the bad guy rips the heart out of the innocent guy and the heart keeps beating, that's going to happen. You can do it. Heart is going to beat. So, cardiac contraction doesn't really require nervous stimulus. Okay? But for our purposes now, we're going to presume that we're going to be talking about nervous stimulation. Just for simplicity, we need an example, okay? We're good? So, that's the resting membrane potential of cardiomyocyte. Okay? You have neurotransmitter that binds to the receptors on the surface of the heart and opens ligand-gated channels. These ligand-gated channels will generate a little bit of a potential, okay? And this potential will start spreading through the membrane by voltage-gated sodium channels. Do you remember what voltage-gated sodium channels are? What opens them and closes them? Changes in the membrane potential. Okay, before we move on, do we understand membrane potential? Just the idea, what it is. Do we need a reminder what it is? We do? Okay. Cell is surrounded by a membrane. On other two different sides of the membrane, there's different distribution of charges. Does that make sense? Let me show. So if this is the membrane, this is outside, this is inside. Normally on the inside, there's a negative charge. On the outside, there is a positive charge. Does that make sense? Amber? Good? That's as deep as it goes, okay? If you need clarification, we can see it separately and talk about it. So you have membrane potential, resting, at rest. The sodium starts to flow in. You have depolarization. By definition, depolarization is when this difference, plus minus, initially goes away and then becomes even like flipped. Does that make sense? So basically, as the result of depolarization, this side of the membrane will become positive and this side will become negative. We're good. So sodium flows in, changes the membrane potential, and that change closes sodium channels at the very top. Okay? Does anyone remember what happens in the neuron after that? Not in the muscle, in the neuron. Or, for that matter, skeletal muscle cell. After sodium channels close, which channels open? Potassium. Do they open here? Yes. So voltage-gated potassium channels open. But here's the deal. When you have skeletal muscle contraction, is it quick? Normally. Single twitch. It is usually pretty quick. You need contraction and relaxation. Because you may need to produce another contraction and another. You need it to be quick. In cardiac muscle, you need a sustained contraction because you're squeezing. Does that make sense? That's all you do. You're squeezing. So, potassium channels are open. Potassium, where does it flow? So again, from inside to outside. Okay? So potassium goes outside. When positive ions go outside, what happens to the membrane potential? Huh? Repolarize, becoming more and more negative. Good, very good. However, if you would look at the graph, you will see it does become negative here, but not to the extent that you would expect from the regular repolarization. Because what happens, this opening also allows calcium to get in. So that plateau due to calcium influx. Okay. Does that make sense? So that calcium influx leads to this sustained contraction. Does that make sense? Then, at some point, don't get me wrong, calcium channels will close. Potassium channels will remain open. And that's repolarization. So basically, if you want to match the graph with the table, depolarization will be step number 1, plateau 2, and repolarization 3. Does that make sense? So now I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to tell. First of all, concentrations of ions. Quickly. Which sodium, concentration of sodium is higher outside? Potassium, inside. Calcium, outside. We can talk chloride. Anybody? Outside. Outside. So basically, for the entire course in physiology, you have to know 4 ions. Sodium, calcium, chloride, higher outside. Potassium, higher inside. That's it. Okay? Seriously. Like, that will help you to survive. Okay? So, what depolarizes cardiomyocyte? We're talking about ionic flow. What depolarizes cardiomyocytes? Flowing into the cell. What happens to the sodium channels on top? When they reach the top action potential? They close. Which channels open? Potassium and calcium. Potassium flows outside of the cell. Calcium flows in the cell. At this particular point, calcium trumps potassium, right? It overcomes it. So you see what? Plateau. When calcium channels close, what starts? Repolarization due to ions. No. Okay, say again. No. Repolarization is due to the wait. Okay, start over. Calcium channels close here. Repolarization starts. Due to which ion? Potassium. Flowing out of the cell. Does that make sense? So what is responsible for plateau? Calcium. Basically, that conversation, you have to be able to say it. If you have, I always tell students who have a sibling, just force them to listen. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, a little thing. There is so-called absolute refractory period. What is it due to? Same deal with sodium channels. Sodium channels, when they close right here, and they just close, they inactivate it. Now, if you ever parked in the gated parking lot where you swipe a card, you know that if you want to invite a bunch of people, you swipe the card, and then you have to wait for some time until your card works again. Does that make sense? So you can't just let of the city in the parking lot. That's pretty much the same deal. When sodium channels are inactivated, it makes sure that there is no sodium influx and there is no depolarization again. So there is no continuous contraction. Remember, we talked, well, maybe not we, but at some point you had a conversation about tetanus. Not the disease, tetanus, but tetanus as the contraction of a muscle. If you do this, that's unfused tetanus. Okay? It's not a complete contraction. Now, if I operate at the maximum of my ability, I don't really know, but probably it is, okay? It's a fused tetanus. So muscle goes into the contraction without any relaxation whatsoever. You can't do it with the heart. Because if the heart goes in the tetanic contraction, that's it doesn't pump. Does that make sense? You don't need power from the heart. You need rhythmicity. Is that clear? So that's the point of absolute refractory period, to avoid tetanic contraction. Your heart rate, for the simplicity, is, say, 60 beats per minute. Okay? So 1 beat per second. Means that your heart contracts 86,400 times a day. If you don't exercise, just lie flat. It cannot do it on fermentation. There's just not enough ATP produced. So its metabolism is aerobic. Okay? But what is good about the heart? It doesn't have to use glucose. Cardiomyocytes can easily use fatty acids. They can use fat, really. They can just take triglycerides and use fat. They can use ketone bodies. They can use lactic acid. What happens in anaerobic respiration, in ischemia? So in ischemia, when blood supply to the heart through the coronary circuit goes down, respiration becomes anaerobic, lactic acid accumulates, pH drops, calcium in the cytoplasm goes up. It cannot be pumped back. Mitochondria are damaged, ATP goes lower, and it leads to the closure of the gap junctions because they need some fuel to be open. When cardiac cells are not connected, your heart cannot contract altogether. Arrhythmia. Does that make sense? I wanted to say something about, lactic acid. By the way, the fact that heart easily uses lactic acid as the energy source, breaks down the common myth that soreness in the muscles is due to the lactic acid production. It is not. Multiple studies demonstrated that lactic acid, now listen to me carefully, lactic acid that accumulates during the exercise lasts in the muscles for about an hour max, and then it's gone. Liver and heart do a very good job in converting lactic acid back into the glucose or pyruvate and then Krebs cycle. Does that make sense? You can ask, wait, why do I feel like crap after, 2-hour weightlifting practice next day? This is most likely due to the microtrauma to the connective tissue in the muscle. It hurts because it's inflamed, and inflammation promotes repair. So as the result of repair, connective tissue in the muscle gets stronger and makes muscles essentially stronger. Okay. So we're going to wrap it up. I will see you on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend.